If you've ever wanted to build a gaming PC to sit alongside your games consoles, there's no better case on the market than this, the Fractal Design Ridge. At about the same size as a PS5 but a little bit deeper, the whole building process is surprisingly easy, even if it's your first time. The Ridge is in a way a spiritual successor to the Node 202, which I've actually built in before, but found that the CPU got way too hot, so I ended up switching to an NR200 instead. Thankfully, the Ridge gives you tons of cooling potential. You get 2 large 140mm fans included, blasting fresh air straight at your graphics card. And there's space for an additional 3 80mm fans for extra exhaust if you wanted to go all out. The case is modern, aesthetically charming, and you even get a magnetic front cover, which has this woven texture that I think is a really nice touch. Compared to a standard micro ATX case like the Define Mini C, also by Fractal Design, you can see it takes up significantly less space, but it towers above sandwich-style ITX cases like the Dan A4 H2O. For this build, I'm aiming to hit modern TV specs, so it needs to play games at 4K at 60 frames per second on mixed settings. If you haven't noticed already, this is a very small YouTube channel, and I don't have the funds for new parts for every video. I'll be using my older components that are still capable of hitting this target. If you're not comfortable with picking up used parts, check the description where you can find a full list of current generation components to use instead. For the CPU, I'm using the Ryzen 5 3600, which you can pick up used on eBay for around $70. CPU cooling in this case is limited, so if you're building a PC around this case, try and get a CPU with a TDP less than 100 watts if you can. If you're buying new, I'd recommend the AMD Ryzen 5 5600 for AM4, the 7600 for AM5, and the 13400 from Intel. For RAM, I'm using 16GB of DDR4, but feel free to stretch up to 32 if you think you need it. For the motherboard, I'm using my B450i from Gigabyte, but considering we're not overclocking, I'd recommend getting the cheapest ITX motherboard you can get. For the CPU cooler, I'm using the Noctua NH-L12S, which almost looks like it was made for this case, and I think you'd be hard pressed to utilize this space any better. For power, I'm using this EVGA 650W SFX unit, but if you're buying new, I'd recommend getting the Corsair SF750, as the cables it comes with are a lot more flexible and aesthetically pleasing. This case supports up to 4 2.5-inch drives, but to keep it simple, I'm going with a 1TB NVMe SSD by Crucial. You can always add more down the road. The graphics card you decide to buy will have the biggest impact on your frame rates in games. It also happens to be the most expensive component by far. I'm using my trusty RTX 3070, which still plays most games at 4K, even whilst being a generation old. The 8GB of VRAM is starting to feel a little bit limiting, but for the most part it's still a really solid option. If you wanted to buy something new, I'd recommend the RTX 4070, and if you prefer AMD, there's the RX 7800 XT. Now for the build, we'll go through this pretty quickly because there are tons of great guides online already. Just start off by taking all the panels and putting them to the side. Assemble your motherboard and CPU cooler and screw it in with the provided screws. Take off the PSU bracket from the case, screw it into the PSU and then screw the whole thing back in. Connect up your cables and insert your graphics card, and then that's it, you're done. The one thing I found that was weird about this case is that even though it looks like this cooler fits perfectly, the power cable ends up putting up significant stress on one of the cooling pipes. And so if you want to use the Noctua L12S, you won't be able to screw in the power cable with both screws. I've tried it in every orientation, and I find this very odd considering this is the exact cooler they use in the instructions that Fractal themselves give you. But even with just one screw, it's more than secure, so I wouldn't worry too much. It's still worth using over any other cooler in my opinion. But other than that, great case, highly recommend.